Good evening, I should say, from London. Good morning to you from other parts of the world. My name is David Shankland. I have the honor to be chairman of the society, and it is even more an honor our this evening to our seminar. Now, of course, Professor Findley has written many books, one of which he's going to be talking about tonight. But I'm sure everybody here was brought up, as I was, on bureaucratic reform in the Ottoman Empire, which is, of course, an absolute masterpiece, a book which really is one of those 3 or 4 books that you just have to read if you understand the Ottoman, if you want to understand the Ottoman Empire. And I learned so much from it when I was writing my doctorate. And if anybody around the table here hasn't read it, then goodness me, I suggest they go out there and immediately and get a copy. They won't regret it. Anyway, so there we are. That's by way of introduction to our most distinguished visitor tonight. And we turn the floor over to him, where he will be talking about Osen, or Dosen, however one wants to use the word, a book that one sees regularly in the antiquarian book catalogues, but of course, really one doesn't know much more about other than the physical object. And so it's really wonderful that we can hear more about it tonight. So thank you very much, and over to you.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if I can share screen. Multiple. Okay. Okay. Can everyone hear me? Our subject today is Mouradgea Dosan and his great work about the Ottoman Empire. I entitled my presentation, Enlightening Europe on Islam and the Ottomans, Mouradgea Dosan on Law in the State, because that's really what he wrote about. His work was intended to be a practical manual of all useful information that European rulers and statesmen needed to know to get along with the Islamic empire of the age. And here on the left, here on the left, if I can find out how to get my cursor going. Last view. Oh, there you go, cursor, laser pointer. Okay, I'm sorry. Here on the left, we have his portrait in his official uniform as a civil official of the Swedish monarchy, with his Vasa order around his neck, his knightly order bestowed on him by King Gustav III. It helps to look into the origins of Dosan's project, and then I'll look into the origins of my own work on him. There's a very specific and peculiar reason why it was the Swedes who wanted this book so badly. It goes back to the Great Northern War and the Charles XII's defeat at Poltava in 1708, after which he took refuge at Bender, then in the Ottoman borderlands, now in Moldova, and stayed there with a very large entourage for 5 years before he was able to get back to Sweden. So the Swedish origins are a long, winding trail that leads from 1709 to Mouradgea's work in the 1780s. Generations of Swedish elites wanted something like this work and produced plans and drafts for it in various languages. What enabled Mouradgea to finish the project was that he had both intellectual capital and financial capital. He had a high level of command of Arabic and Turkish, which he studied with tutors from the ulama. And he had relevant manuscripts. He understood the Linnaean taxonomic methodology, which was what the Swedes wanted. And he also had access through his father-in-law to the chief harem eunuch and thereby to the artists who worked in the palace. His financial capital came first from the father-in-law, who was a very wealthy man. He was at that stage, the financier or saraf to the chief harem eunuch. And so Dosan married money but then he also made money through business ventures, both on his own account and for the Swedish envoys of the period, Gustav and Ulrich Celsing, two brothers who, one after the other, held the office of Swedish minister in Istanbul from 1750 to 1780. And so Dostan is not only able to write a very knowledgeable book, but he's also able to generate wonderful illustrations like this one of an iftar with the Grand Vizier, which is proof positive of an artistic collaboration between Constantine Kappadala, who was then the leading artist in Istanbul, and Nicolas Cochin, who was the king of engraving when Dostan went there in 1784 and was noted for his love of the kind of chiaroscuro effects that you see in this engraving. The origins of my project go back to the time when I was doing my dissertation research for the book, which was just mentioned, Bureaucratic Reform, and then also my later Ottoman Civil Officialdom. One of the most useful sources for me was a strange book by a strange author. It was the title of it was the Tableau Général de l'Empire Ottoman, but then the long subtitle said that it was divisé en deux parties, dont l'une comprend la législation mahométane, l'autre l'histoire de l'Empire Ottoman. Okay, the part that was useful for me was that part, but it was not a history in any sense that I could recognize. It was rather a synchronic account of the Ottoman administration, a topically organized rather than chronologically organized presentation, which was exactly what made it useful for me. The title page, moreover, identified the author as Monsieur de M. Dostan. Okay, well, who is half revealing and half concealing his identity? How do I know I can trust him? Where does he get his information? And why is the part of the book that's most useful for me called an histoire when it's not a history at all in any sense that I recognized? Moreover, it was quite obvious to me that the book work had been published in 7 volumes, which was the kind of edition that I was able to find for the first 20 years of my research. But there were also confusing references to its being published in 3 volumes, and I thought that was a mistake. There was also vague references to illustrations, but if so, where were they? It turns out it was published simultaneously in 2 different editions, and it's only the folio edition that is fully illustrated because it's the only one with pages big enough to hold the big scenes. And here's an original artwork depicting the Babi Humayun Kalemi, the office of the Reis Kutab in Istanbul, which is was produced to refine the image from the drawing from Istanbul for the Paris artists to engrave from. One of the biggest issues, obviously, is that of title versus content. The work is clearly, that is to say, if you start reading it and don't just assume that Dostan is either an Orientalist or a traveler, it is clearly a taxonomy of law and government. In terms of internal distribution, the subject matter is 5/6 law and 1/6 government, but that doesn't mean that the government is inadequately treated. His presentation on law is, moreover, divided confusingly. It's presented as a code, but then he says it's divided into codes. So he's really wants to picture a legal system that he regards as codified, but it has subcodes within it. It turns out that for the first 2/3 of his work, what he's really talking about is the religion code, the same topics, dogma, ritual, behavioral ethics that constitute the basics of Islam, which Turks then and still refer to as ilmihal, and ilmihal manuals are produced to teach people how to be good Muslims even still. Where is history? Well, from Foucault, I learned that natural history and history had not yet fully differentiated. So what he really is producing here is a natural history, a sort of taxonomic array of the Ottoman administration as it was. In other words, his histoire we would regard now as a book about public administration or political science, potentially. The contents of the book, and of course, it takes a hardy, persevering reader to take it all in. The contents include a main text, plus the engraved illustrations, plus vignettes. In my book, I translated a number of those under the heading Mouradgea Speaks. They tend to be sociological and historical digressions, which show light on things as they were then in Ottoman life. And for those of you who've read the letters of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, you know that they are famous for 5 encounters she had. Well, Dausson's book has 5 times 5 times 5. And here is one of the scenes that was most important for him personally, the dinner of a European minister with the Grand Vizier, showing the minister confidently seated here with his interpreter standing next to him. Dausson arrived in Paris in 1784 to write and publish. And once he was in Paris, he got involved in the cultural politics of the period, and that made him a person of interest to certain people at Versailles. It turns out that a duel was about to start between Dausson and Choiseul-Gouffier, who was going to be the last pre-revolutionary French ambassador in Istanbul, and who was an early bird of Philhellenism and Russophilia. Choiseul-Gouffier had published in 1782 his Voyage pittoresque de la Grèce, depicting La Grèce down here as a woman in chains with the Latin motto exoriare aliquis on the rocks behind her, an avenger must arise. Well, take that. Dausson's arrival was extremely opportune for the people at Versailles who were not taken in by this novel pro-Austrian faction that had developed around the king's marriage, but were rather still loyal to the traditional French alliances with the Ottomans and of course also with the Swedes. And Dausson's book is going to end up being dedicated to Gustav III of Sweden, and it's going to be printed at the Imprimerie de Monsieur. And in the French court titulature of the period, there's not just there's really just one Monsieur. It's the title for the king's next younger brother. So already we get signs of royal patronage. And Dausson's text on law and governance is extremely opportune for the anti-Russian faction who wants to argue that Ottoman Empire is not some lawless Oriental despotism, but is in fact a regular, intelligible polity ruled by a system of law. So take that, Choiseul, and take that, Catherine the Great. Okay, what did it take to illustrate these fabulous folio volumes? It's a complex chain of production that has to start with creating original images in Istanbul, all of which have been lost, except we can get ideas about them from some of the engravings in the book. Then in Paris, Parisian artists will, in many cases, have to redraw those images to clarify them for the engravers, and then you end up with 233 published engravings, of which 41 are scenes and the rest are single figures. Who are the Istanbul artists? Well, Günsel Renda was able to establish that Konstantin Kappadala, who was then emerging as a leading artist for the palace, was the most obvious one of them. there must have been others. So we assume that it was him and his workshop, and how many others there were and whether there were others from outside his workshop, we don't actually know. Once you got to Paris, from the signatures placed on the engravings, which of course are not actual artist signatures, but names inscribed on them by a letter engraver, we have 58 named artists, 7 of which do original drawing, and all of the others either engrave or etch. So from that, you get an idea of the distribution of labor that was required to produce the work. Dosson keeps insisting that his illustrations are necessary and not just decorative. It took me years to understand what he meant by this, but it turns out that Choiseul's book is still full of the decorative folderol of an earlier style of book production, which included old decorative fleurons at the start of chapters and cul de lampe at the ends of chapters. Dosson's book has none of that. It has only the kinds of illustrations I'm showing you, which in almost all cases, he actually does discuss in the text. And in many cases, they are literally sources for production of the text. They're part of his source base. Very well. If this is a work of the Enlightenment, how are we doing in terms of order and system? And also, what about accuracy and inaccuracy? Dosson went to Paris with what would seem to us like an astonishingly small collection of sources. He had 13 manuscripts in Arabic and Turkish. He had 11 printed books in Turkish. He had a huge collection of embassy memoranda, the kind of things which the Swedish elites and other diplomats had been compiling about all aspects of Ottoman government for generations. He had his pictures from Istanbul, and he also had his personal experiences. How about accuracy and inaccuracy? The book is fastidiously edited, and it's usually high levels of accuracy in both the text and the plates. I have identified 3 types of errors. There are errors reflecting gaps in his religious sources. He also lacked the earliest Ottoman chronicles, which was unavoidable at this stage. He thought that Ottoman historiography began with Hoja Saadettin, and he also has ahistorical beliefs about the Ottoman Caliphate, which reflect ideas circulating in Istanbul in 1780 after 1774, rather than events of 1517. One of the things I did, since the book was published in so many different volumes with different tables of contents, one of my first tasks was to create a comprehensive table of contents for the entire thing. And you can see this gives you an insight into one of the shortfalls in terms of the implementing the esprit de système. First, the volume 1 started off without including some of the headings that it should have. And I have inserted those in square brackets. See if you can make them out in this table. What he says is his introduction is not his introduction to the entire work, but just to the subject of Islamic law. So he should have had a previous heading that said Islamic law. And then after introduction, he should have added on Islamic law. Under that, he should have had a heading for religious code, because that is in fact what's going to come and fill the first 2 folios. The dogma, the ritual, and the behavioral ethics or morals, those are the 3 big constituents of the Ilmihal literature. And then only after that do we get to his other codes. And of course, they are really subcodes: political, military, civil, judicial, and penal. Then when you finally get to the point after 1820, after his death, when his son publishes the last part of the work, what was announced initially as an histoire of the Ottoman Empire has turned into an état of the Ottoman Empire, a current state of the Ottoman Empire, which of course is what it really was. And by the 1820s, that was the right thing to call it. When Dosson went to Paris, it was a world in which high-level patronage and protection were still essential requirements. As Robert Darnton wrote in his 2014 book, patronage made le monde go round. So Dosson needed this high-level patronage. He by getting permission to dedicate his work to Gustav III, by God's grace, King of the Swedes, Goths, and Vandals. Wow, what a job description. And here's the engraved arms on the dedication page with this banner up here that has those titles and styles inscribed on it. He got it printed at the Imprimerie de Monsieur, which is patronized by the king's brother. And it was more than patronage. Dosson got into arguments about money with absolutely everybody, but there are no arguments about the printing costs. So that means there were no printing costs, and the prince must have paid for it. Darnton's 2014 book was extremely helpful to me in making me understand that the censorship regime of the period could be productive as well as prohibitive. The people who are going to eventually censor the book might actually collaborate with the author during the writing of it. And we find traces of this in an initially mysterious figure whom Dosson first mentions in the spring of 1785. He says he has a Docteur de Sorbonne helping him edit his book for style. He describes the man as an homme de grande littérature, and the editing he describes as la correction. And of course, in French, correction goes way beyond just not making grammar mistakes. So who is this Docteur de Sorbonne? In 1787, when the approbation for the first folio came out, it is signed by a parent de Vassy. And you can tell from the wording of it that he's somebody who has actually read the book and has a sympathetic relationship with it. It's a knowledgeable, appreciative text that he's produced. From the same period, we find other approvals signed by Abbé Parent de Vassy, Docteur de Sorbonne. Those are in other books of 1788. And then in years later, after Mouradgea was back in Istanbul, he is corresponding with an Abbé Parent in Paris in 1796 and 97. So he had a 12-year relationship with this man who helped him write the book and pitch it so that it would get past censorship. So the first sign of the prince's, of Monsieur's interest in the work actually appears not in the when the book was printed, but when this man was assigned, this Abbé Parent was assigned to basically help Dosson. So the French interest then begins not at the Imprimerie de Monsieur, but with the arrival of Dosson and the assignment of a doctor of theology who could prevent the Paris Faculty of Theology, that is the Sorbonne, from criticizing or rejecting the book. One of the hardest things to understand about the book is Dosson's insistence on Islamic law as being codified. What is he trying to prove? Is he trying too hard to prove that the Ottoman Empire was not a despotism? Can Sharia law be codified? Was European law codified? Well, it wasn't in any major state. It turns out there was one country off the charts of most people that had actually codified its legal system in the Spherius law of 1734. Mouradgea does insist that his main source, Al-Halabi's Multaka al-Abhur, is a code which contains the universality of religious legislation. That enables him to maximize his claim that that the work is that Islamic law is codified. But does he really mean codification or something more like the canonization of authoritative texts? The Ottoman ulama of the period did have their books of high repute Kutubi Mutabara, as they called them in Ottoman Turkish, and Al-Halabi's Multaka was certainly one of those. It remains, in fact, a major go-to source for Hanafi fiqh in Turkey to this day. There's also an interesting comparison with another work of the period in the form of Yosef Caro's Shulhan Aruch, which acquired canonical and de facto code status as a manual for practical Judaism in a way that lasted until the reform movements of modern times. So here we actually have an interesting comparison. Al-Halabi's Nisbah implies he was from Aleppo. Cairo wrote his book at Safed in Palestine, which is not far off, not far away. And so we have similar processes of compilation that acquire canonical status going on in both Islamic law and Jewish law in the Ottoman Empire at the same time. In writing a tableau général, Dosson was not just presenting a general picture, he was also addressing polemical arguments of the day. And it turns out that taxonomic works were the premier form of intellectual production in this period, and that the authors of them did, in fact, use them to advance polemical arguments. And Dosson is addressing 4 audiences. One of them, obviously, is the Swedish elites of the day, who ever since Charles XII had wanted a Linnaean taxonomy of all useful information on the Ottomans. So this is a contribution to the Swedish Enlightenment. For the French court at Versailles, this is powerful ammunition for the pro-Ottoman faction around the king's brother, who had later reigned as Louis XVIII, contra the Austrian faction around the king and queen. Dosson's largest audience is the Francophone République des Lettres. And here the enlightened despotism argument is relevant. He's proving that the Ottoman Empire is a polity ruled by a comprehensive legal system. Compare 18th century France or Russia, neither of which could say that. And then his last audience is the Ottoman Reform faction that would come into view around Selim III after his accession in 1789. Dosson is really doing advanced publicity for this Ottoman Reform faction. One of the most interesting things about Dosson is why some of the pictures produced for the work were not published. Royal command comes into play where one of them is concerned. When Dosson arrived in Paris in 1784 to meet Gustave III, who was visiting the city at the time, and Gustave and Mouradgea were kindred spirits. Gustave was sometimes referred to as the theater king. He saw the Sultan's portraits that Dosson had copied from the palace albums, and he immediately came up with the idea that they should be displayed like pictures like medallions on a tree. Well, he had the idea, and who was going to pay for doing all that? And the picture was such a hit that it had to be painted more than once. So presumably all of Dosson's money for Sultan's portraits went into those tree paintings. And then you have other fantastic works like this scening of the Sultan having an outing in the palace gardens with his harem ladies. And the eunuchs have set up a wall of tents around them to maintain the seclusion of the ladies. This kind of outing would be known as the Halveti Humayun, a fabulous image which was drawn by de Lespinasse sometime like 1790. But when the volume that would have included it came out in 1820, there's a missing illustration at just that point. So we have to assume that some of the images or plates were either lost or damaged before the last part of the work came out. I've said that Dosson used his engravings as sources for the writing of his text. Now I'm going to give you some proof of that. Here you have a double page with fold-out engraving of the Mevlud Sharif, an Ottoman nativity ode on the birthday of the Prophet. being celebrated in the Sultan Ahmed Mosque under the patronage of the chief harem eunuch, and with a numbered legend at the bottom identifying 20 different categories of participants. It's a fabulous image about a glorious ceremony, and it's so positive of Dausson's privileged access and of the way he used his engravings as sources in his writings. Through his father-in-law, he had access to the tables of protocol, the Teshrifat Defter Levi, for this occasion. He also had access to the financial records, and he tells you how much it cost. And then he had an ability to station artists in the rear gallery of the mosque, which is the obvious vantage point of the view here, to draw and paint or to sketch while the ceremony was occurring. Another equally grand proof of this appears in plate 45, his picture map of Mecca, showing the rites for the first day of Qurban Bayram, or Eid al-Adha. The holy cities are the only sites depicted outside Istanbul, so they are necessary to illustrate the Hajj, and their uniqueness proves that Dausson is not a travel writer. The importance of this work in Dausson's and this for this publishing project is proved by the fact that Kappadalla painted the original in Istanbul, de Lespinasse redrew it in Istanbul, and then Berthaud engraved it. This is Louis-Nicolas de Lespinasse's first and Pierre-Gabriel Berthaud's only contribution to the tableau. So the leading typographical artist of the period, de Lespinasse, appears now, and the man who would become the lead engraver for the Description de l'Égypte also appears at this site. It's also worth noting that the engraving has documentary value because many of the sites depicted in the legend of 64 sites at the bottom would have been destroyed after the Wahhabis got control in 1803. Yet another illustration of Dausson's use of his engravings as sources appears in this suite of engravings about the zikr of the Rifa'iyya, Sufi order. He really writes like a sociologist of religion. He has this suite of 5 engravings showing what he calls the 5 scenes in the ritual, and he accompanies with it with a text explaining the movements and recitations phase by phase. Only a sound and video recording could do a more complete job. Another of Dausson's focus of interest is that the Sultan took with his pages to provide exercise and diversion for his male retinue from the third court of the palace. And these were known as benish, a word that just means mounting. And so they would go to some 80 different kiosks that the Sultan had in and around Istanbul. Then the Sultan would be entertained with mock combats between the cabbage and the okra teams. It turns out there are historical reasons for those names being assigned to the teams. Dausson didn't know that, but I found out the explanation is in my book. One of the interesting quirks of the period is that Selim III wrote a mock heroic poem in praise of cabbage, which is totally unintelligible unless you know about these mock combats. And the translation of that poem appears in my book, along with its Ottoman text. And of course, another feature of interest is that the excitement generated by these outings, which attracted spectators in some places, presages the fan culture of the modern football teams. And so here you have de Lespinasse's drawing of an outing that includes a Jarid or a javelin competition. And then here you have a close-up from the focal event and the engraving, one of the horsemen being unhorsed. I've mentioned that Dausson included single figure engravings as well as the big scenes. How does he display those? Well, I chose a couple of samples to show you how they are laid out forward to the page in the folio edition. And for purposes of illustration, I particularly chose these two. These are honor guards who would form a sort of like a human square around the Sultan's horse when he rode out in procession. Curiously enough, some of the honor guards at the funeral of Queen Elizabeth recently were doing something like that around the bier carrying her casket. At least it looked like that to me on television. Well, here you have on the right, these were called pakes, and they were distinguished by very tall helmets of gilded bronze with a spray of black feathers at the top. And then here the other honor guard were the solaks, and they were distinguished by a very tall headdress which had this immense spray of white feathers at the top. And so one of the fascinating scenes of the period, anytime the Sultan rode out, would have been to see him on his horse, more or less floating above this sort of wall of feathers as it would have appeared. And here on the right, you have some of the top Janissary commanders. Well, I mentioned that Dausson went to Paris with an amazingly small collection of sources. One of the curious engravings in the book is called Format des Livres Turcs. And we can tell from the names of the books inscribed in ink on the bottom edge of the pages in the Ottoman style that these are just precisely the manuscripts Dausson had with him when he went to Paris to write his book. And the artist has actually drawn them in a heap with an imaginary scene synthesized from two other library engravings. I myself examined the very same manuscripts which Dausson's son Constantine donated to the Lund University Library in 1850. It was a little while after 1850 when I examined them. So it is indeed a quite small source base in that sense. Part of what is interesting about Dausson is to see how his personal ambitions contributed to the work he produced. He certainly did have ambitions. Already before he ever went to Paris, he wrote in one of his letters about wanting to passer en chrétienté, to pass into Christendom. To do that in the society of the period, he would need to become présentable in polite society, and that required at least an entry-level title in either the first or second estate. So either chevalier or abbé at a very minimum in France. And so first he started by getting Gustav to give him a Swedish knighthood, which and here we see his crest from the Ritter Hyacinth in Stockholm. Then later he got back in touch with the king and asked permission to adopt the surname Dausson in memory of an uncle who had shown him une tendresse paternelle. He didn't explain to Gustav that Tosun is actually a nickname. It's a word that means for a young bull or a robust young man. And so asking to be known as the Chevalier Dausson was sort of like asking to be known as Sir Stud, but he didn't explain it to Gustav in quite those terms. Anyway, once he has this, he can make his ethnic and class origins disappear. And this is strategic in terms of his goal of moving from interpreter to envoy, which would also require a change in dress. And that's something that happens anyway once he gets to Paris. His authorship establishes his titles as a citizen of the République des Lettres. So the combination of authorship, French culture, and the noble title have launched him, made him presentable in the salons of the period. And the authorship, well, he also thought he was going to make money doing it. Believe it or not, these large-scale publication projects had been financially successful, and might have been again for him if the French Revolution had not come out. His value to us, of course, is that he became a cultural broker and a mediator between two different cultures. Where is he about non-Muslims? He was one, of course. It turns out, in fact, this his verb and his visual tableaus, and yet his account of Islamic religious obligations ends with a picture of Greek dancing. What has that got to do with Islamic religious obligations? He has concluded his discussion of Islamic ethics by pointing out that some of the prohibitions are honored more in the breach than in the observance, and that was never more true than of music. And then he includes this illustration of this Greek women's dance, which was also the subject of an illustration in Choiseul. So that tips us off to the point that this may be a return to his counterblast against Choiseul, if more muted than in the frontispieces of the works. Choiseul, the contrast appears in the meaning that the two authors attached to this dance. For Choiseul, it's proof that the Greeks' so-called slavery had not reduced their love of dancing. For Dosson, he connects it with the fact that the Greek patriarch every year requested permission for the public celebrations that the Greeks like to engage in at Easter. And the Ottomans, despite their grave way of life and how far this were from their own norms, not only allowed these, but provided police protection for them. So for Dosson, this proves the peaceful accommodation of the Greeks under the Ottoman Empire, not anything about enslavement. Dosson was obsessively fixed on these things to do with the ambassador. Here you have a de Lespinasse original of the Sultan's, of the audience with the Sultan for a new ambassador. Here you have the interpreter bowing humbly while he translates the ambassador's speech. And here you have the ambassador in his sable pelisse with his three-corner hat showing above it. Here you have an equally grand depiction of an audience that actually would have occurred a few days earlier in the Sublime Porte, with the Grand Vizier back here in the corner and the ambassador seated just in front of him. So that's chronologically, that's the first of these accreditation audiences. And here you see, between Capodanno, who had actually designed and painted interiors like these, and de Lespinasse, who was the premier topographical draftsman in Paris at the period, you see the incredible precision with which they could reproduce this kind of imagery. One of Dosson's great fascinations, the lengths that they went to maintain the seclusion of the imperial harem. Here we have this vast engraving, a double folio engraving of the seasonal move from Topkapı to the Beşiktaş Shore Palace. And you have the kayaks for the harem ladies, and they're secluded in tents with eunuchs sitting right outside of them. And you have guards in boats out along the water on either side of the procession. And then in this tiny detail way over there, you have this wall of tents that the eunuchs have erected, double wall of tents, to seclude the women during the short distance they have to walk between landing on the quay and entering the imperial harem. Gender roles come up in many ways, and Dosson has fascinating descriptions about them. One of them has to do with the way Ottoman ladies like to socialize around the tandoor, which was a table covered with blankets with a brazier of hot coals underneath it. And he describes how nice it was to sit around something like this and keep warm. And if European ladies knew about it, they would want to adopt this custom too. The pleasure outing sites of the period are another subject of great interest, and none more so than Khat Hane with the Saadabad Palace. This, of course, is good visual documentation of it as it was before later remodelings, and then after that it was eventually destroyed. And then we have details showing how the men and the women would all enjoy the outing place, but they would keep separate while socializing there. And that brings us to the end. So I will now go back to share screen, I guess. What do I do? Share screen. Okay. All right. Everything okay?
Absolutely beautiful presentation. Thank you so much. It was absolutely clear with this fascinating comparison you make with Chosa Gouffia's book is remarkable. I remember the way that book vividly has a whole series of illustrations of the Greek islands. So you actually almost approach the Ottoman Empire through the romance of the island communities. But clearly you have shown beautifully why this could be a contrast. By the way, you probably need to press stop shared screen.
Stop share screen.
Stop sharing screen.
Oh yes, stop. Okay, good.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, well, indeed. That's wonderful. Could I ask you about, you're very good explaining the different influences, but what about the Anglophone tradition of writing on the Ottoman Empire? For example, was Ricolt not at all familiar or useful to him? Because, of course, he's a pretty good writer in his own right.
One of the curious things about Dosson is that he does not mention any European writers whatsoever in his book. He used no European sources at all, other than those embassy memoranda, which, were written mostly by people like him, that is to say, the other embassy interpreters compiling information in Istanbul from their own experience and observation.
Right.
In his correspondence, he does criticize some of the other European writers. He hated Baron de Todt. I think he liked Peysonnel. It's getting kind of hard to remember now. Yep. But no European sources whatsoever in his book.
Wow. So you don't see any, obviously you see no influence, and obviously nothing of Busbek either then.
Well, quite curious. Of course, he was very Francophone centered. And curiously enough, England in this period was the last place to take an interest in his book. There was an English bookseller who I think called North. No, North was the one he wanted to sell his book, but it was somebody else, Robinson, who went to stage actually selling it and produced pages for an English translation. But the English translation never came out in England. It was instead shipped to America, where new front and back pages were put on it in the 1830s, and it was published as an incomplete American edition. But yeah, so there was
please.
Yeah, so there is no English. I mean, there's an American, but not an English edition.
So the converse of that is in order to marry, surely he would have had to have converted. Perhaps you could explain a little bit more about how you think of that.
Converted to what? His wife was an Armenian Catholic like him.
Oh, okay.
He's a half French Armenian Catholic is Dosson's starter identity. His father was a man named Mouradgea, and I think his grandfather was also known as Mouradgea, and he made most of his career in Izmir. And the mother was from a French family. She was the daughter of I think a consular clerk in Izmir, and the family was named Paji. And the Paji family, somewhat like the Whittals, are apparently still in business in Izmir. Yep. They're still there. It's quite fascinating in that sense.
Yeah, it is. It is. It is. Thank you. That's really helped clarify things for me enormously. But please, colleagues, if anybody would like to start asking some questions, just put your hand up, please, or just jump in. We're only a small group. Just go ahead, please. Well, just whilst people are thinking, you said he talked about the Janissaries. How did he understand that from his perspective?
Well, he tried to account from, he tried to do a taxonomic discussion of the whole thing. And one of the things that's interesting is one of the things that gave me courage to keep using Dosson when I had all those doubts about him initially is I could see that one of the leading Turkish historians of the period, a man named Uzun Çarşılı, relied on Dosson. And whenever he wrote about the 18th century, he used Dosson as if it was another one of his Ottoman manuscripts. And he even found one type of Janissary functionary called the Zembilci, which means the basket maker or basket man. And he said he could find no other evidence of the existence of these except in Dosson. So, you wouldn't think that Dosson, you wouldn't think that Dosson's experience as a embassy secretary interpreter would have positioned him to be maximally well informed about the Janissaries as compared to other things about Ottoman administration. But he did actually have something that the leading Turkish historian of the period hadn't found. It's possible it's an error, but anyway, Zembilci, Uzun Çarşılı gave Dosson credit for finding this.
Well, that's remarkable. Well, I think Mina Turksoy has a question. I see. Let's go to that. Mina, if you want to unmute, you can ask your question yourself, Mina, if you'd like to. Or
okay.
Go ahead, Mina. Good evening to you.
Yeah, hi. Good evening. Hi. Yes, I'm just sorry. Yes. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for that. I was just wondering if you put aside the polemic between Austria and France on how despotic the Ottoman Empire is, what is your feeling about, how despotic or not it is, given the conditions of the time?
Well, of course, that's really different from what Dosson was trying to do. I have, in fact, just been working on the 18th century and trying to catch up with the new books by people like Ali Yaycıoğlu. And all I can tell you is, obviously, there was a great need for reform and re-centralization. Certainly, as time went on, not only in the center, but even as far off as places like Baghdad, people were realizing that the dominance of these big ayans, the sort of people who had turned into warlords, was really counterproductive, especially after the defeats at the hands of the Russians. So as there's a new demand for centralization, and actually there are a lot of ongoing initiatives in all kinds of fields, the sort of traditionalism that we used to think existed, and the deference to Kari Kadim as a way of doing things doesn't mean that they weren't trying new things. And Yaycıoğlu has reforms in local administration about creating smaller ayans who would be sort of like contractors who would have to report not only to Istanbul but to the local majlis. That seems to anticipate the reforms of the Tanzimat, actually. And Mehmet Genç had already showed there was this ongoing innovation in finance. Not only did they have the life-term tax farms, but then they divided those in shares, and eventually you get these or shares, which are sort of like early form of government bonds. So on one hand, the decentralization had reached a degree of excess that needed to be changed, and within that, there's a lot of reformist initiative and dynamism that's already there. And one of the things you could say about Dosson, his book proves that the kind of statistical manuals that governments will start to publish in the 19th century, that kind of information was already there. They just weren't publishing it. He's able to produce a table of provincial organization, which lists all the provinces and their internal subdivisions, and you can count the number of provinces, eyalets and kazas, and sanjaks and kazas from that. And then he also has a sort of taxonomic list of all the other kinds of special territories and special status that were not under the same administrative system, ranging from the holy cities down to these little Kurdish eyalets in southeastern Anatolia and Iraq. Yeah.
I don't know if that answers the question.
Yes, I think so. I mean, this idea of tremendous decentralization with all these layers of institutions is very revealing. It's very revealing to hear about. So would you say that it got more despotic as they centralized? So, towards Abdulhamid's regime and all that. I mean,
my dear, if you want to fast forward to the reign of Abdulhamid, I think only Erdogan has outdone Abdulhamid.
Right. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. There's another question here from Charity Moskopoulos. Would you like to ask your question? You just need to unmute if you would. Well, I'll ask it for you as whilst you're trying to do that if you like, and you can always come in. So the question here is, for the women of the harem, was Dawson able to see them in person, or do you think that he obtained his images through word of mouth?
Well, he's quite explicit about that. Neither he nor practically speaking any other male could see them in person. Well, if they rode out in the carriage, you could see them, the shutters of the carriage. But he got his information, and of course, you see, he had this contact with the chief harem eunuch, which is one of the most important, influential people in the empire. That gives him a sort of the eunuch side view of the imperial harem. And then, in addition, he got his information from women who had been in the imperial harem and had then been married out. There's this, of course, at any given time, maybe up to 500 slave women in the imperial harem. And a lot of these women are eventually, after serving for a period of time, they would be married out to Ottoman statesmen at various ranks. In the case of the Sultan's daughters, they'd be married out to governors general and grand viziers, and then on down they'd be married out to people, to other government officials. And so Dawson got information from the husbands of these women. And in terms of what things were like inside the harem and these engravings that depict it, don't forget, Constantine Kappadalda actually decorated a lot of those rooms. And there were months of the year when the harem was not resident at Topkapi, but was living at the Beşiktaş Shore Palace, and that presumably would have been the premier time to bring artists and decorators in or repairmen to fix the roof and things like that into the imperial harem. So there was time every year when when outsiders could get into the harem in that sense.
That's fascinating. Rashid, would you like to ask a question? I see that you've unmasked yourself. If you'd like to, please go ahead.
No, thanks a lot. I'm just enjoying listening to the fascinating conversation. Thank you.
I see. The other thing which I didn't quite follow, but I should have done really, is why he felt a need to leave the Ottoman Empire. I mean, obviously there's personal ambition and travel and so on, but was there a more complicated reason to leave?
Well, he went to Paris to publish. And one of the curious things about Dosson, in fact, it's a very, in terms of how, Europe and the Ottomans were doing in terms of economic development at that stage, Dosson has no sense at all of the Ottomans being backward economically or in terms of their production processes. He says there are a few things like mirrors and clocks where the Europeans are better, but he didn't perceive anything of the kind. Curiously enough, if he wanted to make a case about the Ottomans being backward, the best case he could have made was by mentioning the reason that took him to Paris to publish his book. The advance of printing and the graphic arts in France, that was the place to go to do something like that. And so if he'd wanted to make a case, that would have been the best proof of it. He went to France to publish. He wanted to launch his family into the Swedish nobility, which he did. His son had no children, but a daughter of his. There are two Swedish noble houses that are related to her, and the son, of course, married a Dutch baroness and had this distinguished career as a Swedish diplomat and Orientalist. So the son has no progeny, but the daughter does. So there's the two different noble houses in Sweden that have Dosson ancestry. And so he was very successful in that sense. And then later, after he had to leave Paris in 1791. One of his children had died. His fortune was lost. His publication project was in suspense. He didn't know what was going to happen next. And he had to just get out of town. And he tried to relaunch his career in Vienna. And then while he was in Vienna, he got this offer. Well, he also got an offer from Catherine the Great, who would have confined him if he had gone to Russia. He had never been seen again. The Swedes wanted him to go back to Istanbul and negotiate a subsidy treaty. The Swedes needed foreign aid from whoever they could get it to maintain their defensive posture against Russia. And not only had they had subsidies from France for many years, but they'd actually had gotten from the Ottoman Empire and wanted to get more. So that's what Dosson went back to Istanbul to negotiate in 1792. And he did manage to get one payment, but the problem is the Swedes couldn't hold their alliance with the Ottomans because of they just couldn't put up that much resistance to the Russians.
Yeah, as you imply, the correspondences with the present day are quite remarkable. Yeah, quite remarkable. But broadly speaking, would you say this was an easy piece of research to do? One of your more straightforward ones?
Heavens, no, quite the opposite. It was the hardest. When I was able to start actually working on this, having gotten far enough along with other projects to begin to prioritize it, I didn't know where to start. I was, and of course, raising money to do this, that's another problem. So my first effort took me to Paris, where I found one or two documents. And then I went up to Stockholm, where just by dumb luck, there was an archivist who liked to help people, God forbid. Can you imagine something like that? And this became the start of a real friendship, because his wife was an American lady who had settled down and was teaching in the international school, and I could actually do professional favors for her through my work with the World History Association. And so I actually won the gratitude of those people. And that man, he buried me alive. He not only knew where to find all the obvious things, he could find a 1,000-page register which had one mention of Dosson in it. And so the correspondence between Stockholm and Istanbul, I have the documents from both ends of it. And my footnoting just goes on like I don't know what, because of trying to cite all that stuff. It slowed me down for years. And then finally I was able to make one last trip to Stockholm, where I got into the embassy papers. In the Foreign Office, there was FO 78 and FO 195. And sometimes the most interesting stuff was in the papers repatriated from the embassy in Istanbul, FO 195. Well, it was the same way in Stockholm. Beşiktaş and his Constantinople papers had Doson's personal correspondence, and that's how I know that he was reestablishing contact with the Abbé Pirron in 1796 and 1797. I wouldn't have known that until I got into those.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was also there's documents about Dosan in the Istanbul archives, but they mostly are about his official work and not about anything to do with the tableau. And of course, you can't show up in Istanbul and say, I'm looking for papers about Dosan. I mean, that's like showing up in the British archives and asking for papers about Red House. That didn't work either. But somebody who's doing open-ended research on the period finds these things, stumbles upon them. And there was a man doing that, Kemal Beydilli, one of the people to whom my book is dedicated. He did a pioneering article in the mid-'80s that started the process of finding the Ottoman archival documents about Dosan. And then in many of the collections they opened later in Istanbul, they had them indexed in a different way, such that you could do subject searches and just purposefully look for documents about Dosan rather than just trying to find them by reading endlessly.
Yeah, I mean, these research projects, which go across almost 3 different continents, well, certainly the opposite sides, obviously are very time-consuming and tricky to do.
One of the stranger episodes occurred at the Free Library of Philadelphia. Believe it or not, that's how I found out they have unique things there, because this English publisher that had actually printed pages to bring out a translation of those songs never did it and sold the pages to somebody in Philadelphia. And of course, this library goes so far back, and they actually bought they have not only the unique American edition that was produced in the 1830s, but they have an atlas of engravings, on large size pages that was intended to go with it. And it's probably the unique copy in the world.
Huh. Wow.
So the English interest, the interest in the work in the English language world is the strangest.
Mm. Yeah. When I was just thinking about the comparative strength of publishing at that time, there were some very beautiful things published in Britain, but my feeling is that the French one was probably slightly better at that time, may have therefore be really the best in the world. I mean, I think would be a reasonable suggestion.
Well, I don't think there was ever a question whether Dosan was going to go to England or not. He was educated in the French French Catholic schools in Istanbul.
Yeah.
His mother was French. Claiming that he needed editorial assistance to bring out his book. Well, okay, but he probably actually didn't. And he could have written a book in French, certainly. And he corresponded in French prolifically. The language, he knew Ottoman Turkish forwards and backwards, and he had a research command of Arabic. The language he didn't know was Swedish. The only thing in Swedish that has his signature is a loyalty oath that he was required to take after the assassination of Gustav III and the accession of Gustav Adolf IV.
So they're communicating in Latin or in French? In French, presumably.
I didn't see any Latin, not by him. The Swedish elites, this here's entourage that was with Charles XII. They became they're known in Sweden as the Karolinerna, and there are sketches and abstracts and plans and proposals scattered around Sweden for something like a tableau général, and one of those is in Latin. But and Dosan would have presumably to go to the Catholic schools in Istanbul, Saint Joseph and what's that other one, Saint Benoit, they're still there. There are people who are still going to the schools he went to. he would, and you know, especially with Latin in liturgical use in that period, Dosal would have had at least a passive command of Latin, but he doesn't use Latin in any of his writings that I've seen.
Mm. Wow. Wow. And did you say that he finished the project completely before he died?
No, his son had to finish it for him. So when Dosal died in 1807, and the son, of course, he had sent his son to Sweden to naturalize him Suédois, as he says in one of his letters, and wanted his son to go to in Sweden, the start of the Lund. And it turns out that Constantine was actually along with whatever king it was during the Swedish conquest of Norway in 1815. And so he was well connected with the Swedish conquest of Norway. I love that. He was well connected with the Swedish elites. And then, of course, he had this career as a diplomat. And so what it took for him to finish the work after his father's death was to get request a diplomatic assignment in Paris for a year or so. I think 1810, 11 or something like that, for long enough to get there and start work on what turned out, you know, what eventually came out in 1820. And of course, by then, the man who had been the patron of the Imprimerie de Monsieur was the king as Louis XVIII, and he liked to give himself expensive birthday presents. And so in 1820, his expensive birthday present was the third folio volume of the tableau.
Yeah, I mean, surely they're expensive. Did you ever get around to acquiring one of them for your research purposes, or did you have to use library ones?
Well, you're not going to believe this, but I couldn't have done what I did if I had not ended up in possession of a complete set of these volumes. It's missing one engraving, which I had to get from a different place. And I had this colleague, a man named Tom Goodrich, who, when he found out I was working on this, he more or less insisted on that I should buy his volumes. I thought, what the hell are you talking about? You know, these are supposed to be worth, I think it was $32,000 was the quoted price at the time. And the next thing I knew, at one of the MESA meetings, Middle East Studies Association convention, I came back to my hotel room one night and just found them on the table in my room. And I thought, oh my God, what's going on here? And it turned out that he was planning to donate them to a library or something like that, which would have given him a tax deduction worth 25% of the market price of the volumes. And so if I would just pay him that, then he would let me have them. Okay, well, you know, I've got small children at home. How am I going to wrangle this? So over 4 years, I found ways to send him installments to pay this off. And so I did, in fact, end up owning them. And the stupidest thing I ever did was pass up what very well likely could have been a chance to buy one of the little Espinasse for this. There was a lady who had one, and she wanted me to see it, and ... I think if I'd been more alert, and who knows? Well, anyway, you know, we do make mistakes along life's way. But it was thrust upon me. And one reason why he was willing to sell them, when I got them, it still had inside of it a receipt. His father had bought these volumes for him in the Netherlands right after World War II, and they had paid $175 for them.
That's a perfectly good investment. Yeah, yeah, really. Yeah. Well, you can see that I once refused the opportunity to buy one, where all the volumes had been bound together, and then they'd been in a fire. So the fire had taken all the margins out until the plate mark, and I would have had to get it disbound, clean it, rebound, perhaps mounted. And I said to the auctioneer, just forget it, you know. And of course, I've never ever had the chance to buy another one. So that was 30 years ago. One does regret these things.
Yes, well, unfortunately, you could not. And you see, then once I had it, I also did my own illustration photography, which cost a lot of money to get the kind of camera that was needed. And I was able to sort of borrow a heavy-duty tripod and lights that I needed, but I did my own illustration photography. So I control all of that, which is otherwise I'd be, you know, chasing down rights and paying fees endlessly, presumably.
Yeah, that's all very good. Well, that's absolutely remarkable. I don't know if anybody else would like to ask any questions. Did you want to ask anything, Peter? I can see that you're in the audience. We've got Peter Andrews with us today. Did you want to ask anything, Peter? Ah, I can see that perhaps people are having trouble unmuting if you catch them unawares.
No, thank you very much. I found it fascinating, and particularly the illustrations, because of course they showed some of the tentage as well. And incidentally, the use of the saraparda to lead the ladies down to the quay explains why the saraparda is not called a saraparda in Ottoman, but sokak.
Yes, I'm not sure I understand. The audio was not perfectly clear at my end. Can Craig, can you and maybe somebody interpret for me, or David?
Yeah, Peter, could you enlarge upon your point a little bit? Because I'm also not familiar with the terminology here.
A saraparda is the enclosure screen, which is erected on a series of poles. We saw that in several of the
Oh yeah, okay. Is that what it's called in Turkish?
saraparda is Persian, but one would expect that term to be taken over in the Ottoman Empire as it was in Mughal India, but it wasn't. They're always referred to as sokak, which is a very strange name when you take the present meaning of sokak.
Well, okay. Yes, I'd like to see how that this Persian term you mentioned, I'd like to see that in writing, because then I could look to see if it's in my Ottoman dictionaries. There's, of course, so many Persian terms that are. I myself have not known what to call this, something like this two-sided array of curtains that they erected on the quay. For the women.
I call them enclosure screens.
Yeah. Well, my book is being translated into Turkish right now, and one of the things we're stuck on is what to call that. And
you'll probably find it in Nurhan Atasoy's book, which is called Otagi Humayun.
Oh,
that's a very comprehensive review of Ottoman tentage.
Oh, great. I thank you for mentioning that. Of course, I know Nurhan.
Published by one of the banks.
Our library will have it, I feel sure. Nurhan Atasoy.
Nurhan Atasoy.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, you know, calling it a sokak, I mean, once you have something like this, screens erected on two sides for the women to pass through, I mean, it's not surprising that they could come up with since that's the ordinary word for street.
Yes. Well, I have come across this use of them elsewhere, but this is specifically Ottoman, and therefore helps us to understand the context.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much. That is very helpful. I'll look for Nurhan's book.
Well, thank you for those comments, Peter. Any more points anybody would like to make from our audience? No. Well, in that case, we have to thank you, Professor Findley, for a magnificent talk. You know, I first heard you speak in the 1990, I think it was, Mesa conference, but I've not had the privilege of hearing you speak since then. So that's more than 30 years ago.
I wonder what I was talking about in the 1990 Mesa conference.
Well,
I've just come back from this year's.
Oh, well, I'm sorry I wasn't there, because I do enjoy them, but of course it's quite a long way away.
Yes.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed. It's been a privilege to have you with us tonight. And we all look forward to reading your book.
Well, thank you very much. And I enjoyed it myself.
Thank you.
Tack så mycket, as they would say in Sweden.
Right. Well, we wish you good evening then from London and good morning to you from America, as it were.
Okay, thank you.